Originally slated for a November 11, 2022 release, which would put it exactly 11 years after Skyrim, Starfield was pushed back a couple of times. Most expected it to appear in the first half of 2023, but the latest announcement showed off the September 6, 2023 release date. You can expect to get your hands on Starfield on PC and Xbox Series X and S. Starfield is an open-world RPG that steps beyond Bethesda's Elder Scrolls series to experience a vast galaxy filled with explorable planets. Customization is at the forefront. You'll be able to customize your character both at the start of the game and when leveling up, your spaceship and even your guns. In addition, you'll be able to establish outposts throughout the galaxy as you explore this slice of the universe. Combat will play a huge part of Starfield, with many enemies to take down from bandits to more organised groups of foes. You'll also be engaging with the conversation system, making decisions that will impact your adventures and how you're perceived throughout the galaxy. Players familiar with the Elder Scrolls series may see some mechanics that make them feel at home too. Pickpocketing, lockpicking, persuasion minigames, NPC companions, factions and base building will all be present, albeit with a sci-fi twist. During June 2022, Bethesda showed off the game's character creation tools with plenty of options for body types and skin tones. In addition, you'll select a background which comes with starting skills that help you define how your character begins their adventure. These classes are termed things like Combat Medic, Professor, Homesteader or Bouncer, which each gives you certain starting skills. These skills will be instantly familiar to anyone who's spent time in a modern RPG, as they cover areas like persuasion, bargaining, medicine, and of course, because we're in space, lasers. When you level up, you'll be able to customize your character more, choosing new skills and upgrading them by using them or completing certain challenges. You'll also have access to traits that will give you bonuses, but many also come with negatives you'll have to take into account. For example, Spaced makes you more robust in space, but less tough on the ground. Dream Home gives you a wonderful house, but you'll need to pay upkeep on it. Kid Stuff brings your character's parents into the game, allowing you to visit them, but 10% of your money will go to them. If you've played Oblivion before, you'll recognise the adoring fan you get from Hero Worshipped, who will annoy you and give presents in equal measure. Each of these will give you problems to solve that will help define your RPG character. Bethesda has gone on the record stating that there will be over 1,000 planets in Starfield's galaxy, and you'll be able to land on and explore them all. These will be generated through a mix of procedural generation and hand creation, hopefully giving us a nice mix of barren planets and others with more crafted experiences. The game will take place in an area known as the Settled Systems, a region of space that spans 50 light years around Sol. Two factions vie for supremacy over this area, the United Colonies and the Free Star Collective, who at the start of the game are enjoying a period of tenuous peace. There is no multiplayer announced for Starfield, meaning this is set to be a single-player experience, the kind of which Bethesda specialise in. That said, we do not know if there will be multiplayer elements present in the game in some form. All we know is that in everything announced so far, single-player has had the focus. Todd Howard from Bethesda has stated unequivocally that Starfield will be moddable, much like Fallout 4 and Skyrim. In a 2021 interview, he said that their plan was to have full mod support, something many of us will be glad to hear, as modding has often been the big draw with Bethesda games. That said, Starfield will feature a brand new game engine, Creation Engine 2, so we'll see how fast mods start appearing once the game has been released. Bethesda's 45-minute deep dive into Starfield was one of the most fascinating parts of the Summer Games conferences, offering a huge amount of insight into the technical underpinnings of one of the most ambitious upcoming games. After taking the time to investigate it more deeply, I'm about to cover everything from the reasons behind the game's 30 frames per second console target, what 4K on Series X actually means, the implications for Series S, and the rendering tech on display. First up, the elephant in the room, the frame rate. It wasn't actually discussed on the show itself, but Todd Howard later stated in an interview with IGN that the game would run at a locked 30 frames per second for consistency, with a 4K output resolution on Series X and 1440p for Series S. It's not unusual to see Series X releases run at 4K 30, but it is slightly rarer to see no option for a lower resolution target, and perhaps reduce settings to hit 60 frames instead. So why doesn't Starfield offer this option? The answer is more nuanced than you might expect. John puts forward the argument that a frame rate target is a design decision. After all, even consoles in the 80s could hit 60 frames per second, but clearly many developers have opted for a 30 frames per second experience instead in the decades since. The question is, what frame rate allows you to hit your design goals for the game? In the case of Starfield, it's clear that this is an open world, or even open universe game, with item permanence, AI, simulations, and a lot of interlocking systems to create an immersive experience. With all of the CPU demands that this sort of a game entails then, dropping the resolution might not have much of an effect on the overall frame rate. As a developer, you may as well crank up the visuals and embrace that 30 frames per second output for an overall more consistent output, knowing as well that the PC release should be running at 60 frames per second for those that need a higher frame rate and have machines capable of delivering it. The expectation of 4K 60 frames per second also somewhat ignores the fact that most AAA games run at sub 4K internal resolutions anyway, which are then scaled up to a 4K output using FSR2 or other techniques. Based on pixel counting the Starfield trailer, one scene featured an internal resolution of 1296p, which is 60% of 4K. In that kind of scenario, you have much less latitude in reducing resolution further to boost performance compared to native 4K. Time will tell how well Bethesda's target frame rate is maintained, but in general, a consistent, properly frame-paced 30 frames per second feels better than a game that runs unlocked in the 30 to 60 frames per second range, as we saw in Star Wars Jedi Survivor and the Final Fantasy XVI demo, so the decision at least makes some sense from that perspective. Beyond the frame rate, Bethesda devs call out Starfield as being the first truly beautiful game that Bethesda has ever made, and a lot of that comes down to improvements to rendering techniques, particularly the use of real-time global illumination, reflections, and motion blur. The global illumination doesn't appear to be a per-pixel solution based on ray tracing from the shots in the trailer, but it still makes a big difference to the look of Starfield, with more realistic shadows and lighting that takes on the colour and directionality of its source. Obviously, creating baked lighting for the many areas in the game would be a challenging task, so having a dynamic solution makes a lot of sense. Reflections on shiny surfaces are also handled in a different way than in past Bethesda games, as real-time cube maps are used, something we've also spotted in Horizon Forbidden West and Gran Turismo 7, instead of screen space reflections. This likely ties in with the global illumination, with both the GI and reflections updating every so often to keep lighting, shadows and reflections in line with reality. This is a cheaper solution than ray tracing alternatives, and again makes sense given the breadth and number of the explorable locations in the game. Per object, per pixel motion blur has also been added to the game, and this contributes perhaps more than anything else to the overall look and feel of the game in motion. Interestingly, ID Software contributed to the implementation of motion blur in Starfield based on their expertise with the technique in Doom Eternal. Motion blur is incredibly important to maximise the perceived fluidity of 30 frames per second titles, so given Starfield's focus on gunplay, its inclusion, as well as a more dynamic camera and solid animation work, is canny. Screen space shadows are another new feature added to the creation engine for Starfield, and here they help to provide shadows for fine detail, like players' hands and gun models, as well as environmental details like small rocks and grass. This, in combination with boost to ground detail, potentially by hardware tessellation, means terrain doesn't have the tiled appearance common to previous Bethesda open-world titles, and it looks fantastic. Above the ground, there appears to be a fairly good simulation of atmospheric phenomena, such as light scattering and long-range volumetric fog of a kind we don't normally see. Only games like Horizon Forbidden West and Red Dead Redemption 2 have managed to maintain realistic fog and shadowing well out into the distance, helping sell the reality of long vistas. These far-field rendering techniques are something that Halo Infinite still lacks, so it's important that it's been included in the visual feature set here, given the game's scope. While these additions have shown a clear progression from Fallout 4, character rendering and animation during dialogue sequences remains something of a weak point. While a nice bokeh depth of field is applied here, and in other settings to great effect, the faces do look a little flat, without much in the way of emotion, giving them an uncanny valley feeling. This is a bit of a surprise given the graphical leaps elsewhere, and more convincing progression in this sort of rendering between the first and second Horizon games, for instance. Despite this slight disappointment, Starfield as a whole impresses as a visual showcase, and the gameplay looks solid too. The gunplay looks much weightier, first and third person cameras work well, and the system for highlighting actionable items in the game world is clean and easily passable. The inventory and menus as a whole look great, with a distinct style based on that NASA punk aesthetic that doesn't sacrifice clarity. There's still plenty to discover about Starfield, of course, so we'll be paying close attention to its graphics, gameplay and systems as we approach its 6th of September release date, less or just over a month away. Success or failure though, Starfield looks destined to be one of the most fascinating releases of 2023. I hope you've enjoyed this look at Starfield. We're certainly very excited about this one. If your PC is not up to spec to run this game, remember to visit www.custompcaustralia.com.au. Also check out our Spotify podcasts under Custom PCs Australia. Thanks for listening, we will see you in the next one.